raise a glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub in search of icons and the icons throughout prehistory who made them. Joining me as always here in our favorite little corner of this little quarantine zone which we call the Cross Time Pub are Jason Pintrail and James Waldo. Gents, geologist James, how are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well, Mr. Hanks, and Happy New Year.
Well, a happy 2022 and a very delightful new year to you. Jason, I hope that you are having a delightful beginning to your year down there, a little further south.
Yeah, absolutely am, man. It's beautiful weather, nice and warm, and I am tucked away here in the corner of the Cross Time Pub, ready for a brand new show for 2022.
A brand new show for 2022, and I bet you're working on your next book, aren't you?
Well, coming this fall, I'll be working on the next book. But yeah, I'm ready to get back out there and start the next one.
Yeah, well, since we're already talking about the next one, why don't you tell the fine folks at home all about what just dropped over the holidays? This is big news. We've got a huge announcement to make here, folks.
Well, yeah, it's a couple of years worth of hard work. And my first book, Paleo-Indian Mammoth and Mastodon Kill Sites of North America, is finally available on Amazon. So you can search it by the title, which is rather long, or you can just look up Jason Pintrail Books, and you can find it there on Amazon. If anyone is interested in a signed copy of the book, you can contact me at jason@sevenages.org, and I can make that happen for you. But yeah, it's had a really good response. It's been out for a few weeks now, and it's selling quite well. I'm getting a lot of good feedback on it, and everybody seems to be happy with it. So I certainly appreciate all the kind reviews and the fact that people have been reaching out and commenting on it. And, again, this was a Seven Ages team project. Both of you gentlemen were greatly involved with the process of design and editing and all the great things that go into creating a book from scratch all the way up to production. And so, again, I want to thank both of you for being an integral part of the team and helping me out so much with that, along with all of the other fine folks out there who helped me along the way.
Indeed, I'm proud enough to say that I was one of the first people who read the book. I've read the entire thing, well, more than probably 2 or 3 times all the way through. And James, I can also speak on your behalf in saying that this is a great book for those who not only love archaeology, but also paleontology, and who want to learn a little about the process of archaeology and how that applies to the Paleo-Indian period in America. It's a great thing to be able to learn about this, and unique, I think, from an avocational perspective. So Jason Pintrail, his first written contribution to this great field. Wonderful to have this. And, of course, brought to you by the fine folks at Seven Ages Research Associates.
Yeah, and, I think you talk about 16 kill sites in the book, and there's enough information in each one of those to really adequately describe the sites, but it's also a great jumping off point for any avocationalist or researcher that wants to learn more about any one of those sites or all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's written for the general readership. So, I did keep it kind of simple and to the point. We talk about, the discovery of each site, the evidence that was presented from each site, and the conclusion, along with some photographs and other good bits of data. So there's 3 appendices in the back that kind of talk about some of the general issues surrounding the Clovis people, that techno-complex, and some of the intricacies of what we know about them. But yeah, it's a good pickup place for anybody who's just wanting to get into the subject and know a little bit more. And again, the book itself actually focuses on the known, researched mammoth and mastodon kill sites throughout North America. So that's at the heart of what the book's about.
Indeed. And actually at the heart of what we do with Seven Ages is we try to educate the public. And rest assured that mission continues with this book in a print publication form, and in fact in the show notes for this episode right there on your smartphone or podcasting app, you'll be able to access a link to where you can find this book online. And that's not all, because apparently these two have been busy little elves over the holiday season. I see that there is also a Patreon link. What is this?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is something that the fans have wanted for the last couple of years. We've had people contacting all of us via email and social media asking about more content. You know, a lot of folks, they just can't wait for that next episode of Seven Ages Audio Journal to come out. People are always anticipating the next topic. They want to know what the next show is about. And so I filled a lot of those inquiries on my end. Lots of people wanting to know how they can get more of what we do. So with that in mind, 2022 will launch our brand new Patreon page. We finally jumped into that pool, and we've got some great content over there. It can be found at patreon.com /7 Ages Podcast, or if you have an account over there at Patreon, just type in 7 Ages Podcast. It'll come right up. We have 3 tiers of membership over there. And so we have a new show hosted by myself and James called the Cross Time Pub. And it's a kind of an extension of the flagship podcast here, where we're able to talk a little bit more in depth. We have a wider array of topics that we're able to cover on there. There's so much happening in the world of archaeology, both in the news as well as the research field, that we often can't fit everything into our main show. So this is a great outlet for us to be able to pick up some of those stories, talk more in depth with some of the guests that we have here on the main show, as well as bring you some exclusive interviews that you'll only find over there at the Patreon channel. And we also are going to have an additional special segments, continuation of some of the things that we do on here, such as odd bits of history, the history of alcohol. And we're also going to be introducing some brand new segments, such as James's Rock of Ages. All right. So we already got one of those up on one of the new episodes of the Cross Time Pub. It's nice to be able to get some geological perspective. And so, James, tell us a little bit about your new segment over there, the Rock of Ages.
Yeah. So the Rock of Ages, my way I envisioned it, it was kind of a general interest geologic segment. And so what I've been working on is the geologic history of North America, and not just the, boring why there's mountains or why there's this, but lots of interesting things about that. I would think most people actually don't know about the places where they live, why they look the way they do, and the way they are.
Yeah, very good. And so I learned a lot from his first segment. We've also got a new installation of Famous Feuds over there presented by James. And again, it's a fun show. It's a little bit more laid back, and we have a lot of great guests. So feel free to look us up on Patreon. Again, that is 7 Ages Podcast. And we certainly hope you enjoy the new content, and we're going to have a lot of fun with it in the coming year.
Well, you guys have certainly led the charge on this, and you've done a fine job. I am eager to see what the two of you produce, and of course what the team also will continue to roll out in the days ahead. I myself have been very busy over the holiday season. I have been hard at work, logging about 9 hours at a time on days where time allows on a new documentary project that 7 Ages will be rolling out, and I hope here in the first quarter, actually maybe in the first month of 2022, that this will be ready. More on that in the future, and you guys will hear it first right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. And of course, as we're kicking off 2022 with everything that's going on, we would be remiss if we didn't mention our fantastic friends over at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. What's happening over there in Tennessee, Jason?
Well, I'm excited to say that we have a brand new relic room and a brand new year. So joining us here tonight to tell us about all of the brand new things over there at the relic room is the one and only Chase Pipes.
He's here.
Hey, good evening, guys. How are you?
Man, we are doing just fine. All the better having you here with us. How you doing, buddy?
Oh, doing great. I'm excited about a new year, at the shop, and excited about a new year for you guys.
Yes, indeed. Well, we do have a lot of good things going on, but so do you over there at the Relic Room in Sevierville, Tennessee. So first of all, congratulations on the expansion of the new shop. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we finally got it finished. And what we did is we literally doubled the size of the Relic Room inside the Knife Works. So you come inside Smoky Mountain Knife Works. It's 110,000 square foot knife store with guns and kitchen stuff and all kind of museum displays all over the place. And we've got about 20,000 square feet. We used to have about 10,000 square feet within it. We've now got about 20,000 square feet within the store. So we literally doubled the size of our of our space, and we have officially filled it all up. Didn't take too long, but we were able to expand a lot of our historic displays, a lot of our artifact displays, a lot of our fossil and mineral collection we were able to expand on. So that's really exciting to be able to have more space where people can come and see things that, you know, they normally wouldn't be able to see in a museum or in other, you know, businesses that are like ours. So anytime we can do that, it is great. So it's finished and it's definitely worth coming and seeing.
Indeed. Yeah. Jason told me after he was over there, Chase, that I wouldn't recognize it from the way it looked last time I was there. And in fact, when he was there, he didn't recognize it either. That's how much improvement, how much expansion's been happening. I cannot wait to get over there and see it again.
Yeah, absolutely. The store looks great. Congratulations. It really has. When he says expanded, it truly has. And the new displays look great. All new glass cases, lots of things to see. But on the education side of the house, we've got Chasing History Radio, the podcast. And then we also have the Chasing History YouTube channel. So tell us what's new on both of those.
Yeah, we've just put together a lot of great new episodes on our YouTube channel. The last one that just dropped was with a friend of ours who is a Theodore Roosevelt reenactor. You know, a lot of the stuff that we get at the Relic Room, you know, I'll actually go out and work with the men and women who are in the field discovering the stuff. And a lot of stuff I go out and dig myself, especially on the fossils and minerals aspect of it. So on these trips, you know, we stop in and see friends, see historic sites, and just do great. Anytime we see a chance to tell a story, you know, and get it on film, we do that. So a good friend of ours in Medora, North Dakota, which is it's so far away from anything. It is like Canada. You might as well be in Canada because it's almost there. So we go up to almost Canada. And he is a Theodore Roosevelt reenactor for the city of Medora, North Dakota. So he walks around, him and his wife walk around as Theodore and Edith Roosevelt. So we did an interview with him as first person as Theodore Roosevelt. So on Chasing History, we interviewed President Theodore Roosevelt. And it is a great episode. The audio's a little wonky, and that's our fault because we're not professionals. We're novices. We're doing it with love and passion, like you guys. You guys are a lot more professional than we are. But it's got a lot of great conversations with him as President Roosevelt, you know, talking about his time out west. And also we kind of bring it out of that characterization and talk to Larry Marple, who is the reenactor, and talk to him about what it's like to be a historical interpreter, you know, in portraying such an important historical figure. So that's a really exciting episode that we've got. And we just dropped that episode also on the podcast as well a few hours ago. So that's a good one what we've got going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll make sure we share all that content for you guys on our social media outlets. And finally, Chase, that time of year is approaching fast where you take one of your yearly sojourns out west. So where are you heading this time and when are you heading there?
Now, this is my year really doesn't end until, you know, February of 2022 or whatever year we're in. It gets confusing over the past couple of years, but we literally pack up a third of the store and haul it 2 days west to Tucson, Arizona, and set up at the Tucson Gem, Mineral, and Fossil Show. Now, that is the largest gem, mineral, and fossil show in the world. There are more people there from other countries buying and selling than there are people from the United States buying and selling. It is insane. It's so hard to describe, but literally the entire city of Tucson, Arizona shuts down. All the hotels empty out their bottom floors and they rent their rooms. They pull out all the furniture and rent the rooms, and you basically build a mini store inside of a hotel room. And so every parking lot has tents set up. Every hotel's got these set up. Every conference center's got stuff set up. It's literally the entire city of Tucson. So we go and we involve ourselves in that madness. It lasts, the show itself is about 2.5 to 3 weeks. We're there for around 40 to 45 days. So we're heading out to Arizona. And this is where we get an opportunity to, hang out with the people who make a living digging and discovering gems and minerals and digging and discovering fossils. And so this is where a lot of our fossil guys, come and we meet up and hang out, and we see all the new things that they've discovered, all the new fossils that they've prepped out. For me, it's my favorite time of year because it attracts not only people from the from the public and from the amateur community, but it also attracts a lot of people from the academic community as well. Because in fossils, the academic community and the public community work really, really, really well together. And they kind of help each other make new discoveries to further, fossil science. So it's a great chance to sit down and nerd out with, all these great minds from all over the world who come to play. And so for me, it's my big nerd out in fossils and minerals of the year. So we're really excited about that. And we also pick up a lot of great stuff for the shop, and we'll have a lot of that stuff back at the shop in March. So March is a great time to see us. We'll have a lot of brand new stock and on our website as well.
And as always, we urge everyone to get out there to the Relic Room. Remember, that's inside the Smoky Mountain Knife Works in Sevierville, Tennessee. As always, Chase, we thank you for sponsoring the show, 7 Ages Audio Journal. You are a main contributor to our sponsorship, and we certainly appreciate that. We thank you again for that. And as always, you can hit up therelicroom.com to find some of those great items online, or visit the store inside the Smoky Mountain Knife Works. And as always, man, we thank you for being here.
I know. Thank you guys, because what you're doing is important. We need more shows like this. I mean, that's why we sponsor, 7 Ages, is because you guys are doing a phenomenal job. So anybody out there listening, please comment on this show. Please subscribe. Please tell your friends. Pass the word out. You guys have got a fantastic show, and we want to see you guys continue on.
Well, thank you so much, brother. That means so much. We got to get Waldo out there to the Relic Room. I mean, he is going to have a cow when he sees all the fossils. As a geologist, I know he's just going to love going in there. It's literally like going back in time. James, I can't wait for you to see it.
Yes, sir. I feel like I'm missing out on, we're having this conversation. I'm sitting there, I was like, well, I've never even been there before. But while we were talking about it, I started wondering, I was like, Chase, what is your favorite fossil, or what's your best specimen that you've got in the Relic Room?
Man, that's really hard to nail down. You see, my problem is I'm obsessed. Like I really have a problem. I like all of it. Like it doesn't matter where it is in the past, what it is in the past, whether it's human history or natural history. I love all of it. But probably my favorite thing is I've got a Triceratops vertebrae that's covered in lava.
That's pretty cool.
I know. I know.
That's
and I got to explain it for a second, because it is kind of mind blowing. How can a Triceratops vertebrae be covered in lava? And this is another instance where context is king, because this fossil was discovered in Wyoming out of the Lance Creek Formation. So that's what's so cool about fossils is, and the importance of collecting fossils is once they're exposed on the surface, they're open to the elements of erosion and the forces of destruction. So the only opportunity where that fossil could have been hit by lava is through one of the Yellowstone volcanic earthquakes, because it's in the right regions. So what would have had to have happened is that fossil would have had to first been buried and then fossilized. Then that specimen would have had to been exposed to the forces of natural erosion. And while that fossil was exposed, in this brief window before the freeze-thaw broke it to pieces, the Yellowstone volcano would had to have erupted, and then the ash flow would have had to have covered it and then redeposited that again. And then after that, it would have had to wait for millions of years before it was eroded back out and exposed again. So it's a piece that I like, because it tells not only of this fossil history, but also of the natural geological history and processes of the Earth. And to me, that's just a phenomenally cool piece.
It's like a layer cake of science, man.
Yeah, that one fossil.
Yeah.
If you know how to read the story, it really has this fascinating background. Every fossil and really every rock, if you're trained in that, you can look at that and go, oh, you can see this past history, almost visualize it, I think. And that's one of the things that I think is always very interesting about geology.
Dude, that's why I love geology, man. I mean, it's that deep time, story.
Yeah.
So
yeah, cool.
Yeah, so much of this stuff has a story. And, we have learned so much in our visits to the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. I think it's very important also that having you here right now, Chase, that we discuss the recent passing of a dear friend of yours and of the Seven Ages team, David Dean. Jason and I had the pleasure, really the privilege of being able to meet him while we were there together at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room at your invitation. It was such a special experience. He sat down on the microphone and talked with us. He shared some of his own artifacts. He was very involved in education there in Eastern Tennessee. And he was really just a pivotal part, I think, of education in the community, not only in your region, but really broadly for all of us who engage with this topic. So, losing David, he was truly a giant. We learned about him and his work through you and through Chasing History, which is so special to us. And, we would love to give you an opportunity to say a few words about David and his life, his work, and many contributions to this field.
Well, first off, I really want to thank you guys for, going way out of your way to take the time to, talk about David and to honor him and honor his life and to honor, this idea of citizen scientist. And I cannot thank you guys enough for doing that, because David, he was a remarkable human being. And he represented this old guard of, person. He started in the 60s, when the academic world and the amateur world really depended on each other and really worked close in tight. Which is why, he was involved in so many different things. David was really responsible for getting Chasing History the legs that it needed to go. The episode that we did with him is still our, top episode that we've ever filmed, where he shows us how to identify a prehistoric Native American site. The speed that episode generated and the conversation with him is what gave me the passion and the drive to keep going on and to keep, continuing, his legacy of, getting out and teaching people about the past, teaching people about history. David would, anytime that we had a question about anything, David would show up with a stack of photocopied paperwork and books, and just be like, here you go. Here's everything that you want to know. And that's something that takes time to put together. He would even highlight things that you would need to read. And he was always excited to dive in with somebody and to really nerd out with them also on whatever topic they were interested in, whether it was geological history, fossil history, or archaeology. That's the thing about David is he was into geology. He literally added species he literally added known species to and helped to write the book on what known Ice Age species were present in Tennessee, during the Pleistocene. He added, I think it was 15 or 20 species that they had no idea were in Tennessee. And he's like, well, wow. Yeah, here they are. Here's the bones and here's where I found it. And so they were working on a book, and they actually they had to stop the printing of that book to redo it to add in everything that David was doing. I think Carnegie Museum was who he was working through with that project. But, he added a lot to fossil history, and he also added a lot to prehistoric Native American archaeology, which was his love and passion. Where he excavated and helped on a lot of sites in Upper East Tennessee. He's an idea of somebody that loves the history of their home and can step in and help out where the academic world needs help. The problem is that there's not enough volunteers and there's not enough funding, and sometimes you need knowledgeable people that devote themselves to it, that can step in and help you out. And David was one of those persons that would always step in and would always help out. He did an ID night at local museums and rock clubs all around the area. He was always there to share his knowledge and do it freely, do it on his own dime, his own gas, everything. So David he really meant a lot to us, and he had a great sense of humor. One of my funniest things that he brought me a peccary bone, a fossil pig, basically, and said that this was killed by the famous Ice Age hunters Younger and Dryas, which I'm sure some people will get the joke.
We will,
but it's little humor like that, that he loved to share. He was an authority on prehistoric Native American history in Upper East Tennessee. He was working on a book, which we are planning on finishing, on prehistoric Native American projectile points, a typology for Upper East Tennessee.
Excellent.
Which there was a lot that wasn't known. So David was and I shouldn't say was, he is, because I still feel him with us, and he'd be one right here saying, man, you don't need to talk about me. I didn't do anything big. He was an aw shucks, kind of guy, but he really was. He did a lot to get a lot of people started and to fuel that passion, to get them to, want to protect and save and learn and study and understand our past. So, yeah, and a good friend.
He certainly was. And, I got to say, Chase, I'll never forget one of my favorite memories, Jason Pentrail sitting in my kitchen saying, you got to watch this video. Check out these two guys. And it was you and David out there in the field. That was the video, the one you're talking about, that put you on our radar. That opened my mind to some of the archaeology in Eastern Tennessee, and that brought us all together here right this moment. We have David to thank for that. We really do.
You're exactly right. We really do, because we wouldn't all be sitting here right now if it wasn't for David Dean.
That's right. He touched and changed all our lives. And again, I really encourage people to go back in the archives on this show, listen to the episode that we did with him, but, more importantly, go to the Chasing History YouTube channel and watch those rich illustrative videos that you did, Chase Pipes, with David Dean. You guys are just an educational powerhouse, and like you said, he may be gone from this mortal plane, but his legacy will live on through your videos, through his writings, his many contributions, and, everything that you guys embody there at the Relic Room. So again, thank you for promoting and keeping alive the memory of David Dean. We all will miss him. We won't forget him.
Well, thank you guys for doing this. I mean, this is great. We really do need more citizen science out there, and I think David was a great proponent of that. We don't need we need educated people out there, and you don't have to be at a university to be interested in a topic. You can be an amateur and still have a passion and still add to this topic. And so we need more of that. And David was a great proponent of that. So, hopefully his legacy will be continued on in, that spirit of citizen science.
Certainly. And I hope, if nothing else, many more citizen scientists will be born out of this conversation. Of course, as always, we will have the Smoky Mountain Relic Room linked there in the show notes. Thank you, Chase Pipes, for being on here with us this week. And continuing this discussion about David Dean, his life and his work, before we get to the main interview on this edition of the podcast, it's going to be a longer episode here as we kick off 2022. That is our continuing commitment to all of you out there to bring you the very best in prehistory. But we now go to additional commentary. Zoen McLachlan joins us. He's going to give us his own recollections, perspectives, and some of his favorite memories working and studying under the late and the very great David Dean.
I'm Zoen McLachlan, and I met S.D. Dean as an undergraduate at East Tennessee State University. I was looking for a thesis, and I found some lithics that needed to be analyzed. I was told about S.D. Dean, and when he was told about me, he already knew he was ill. It got him out of the house, and I felt so bad, but you couldn't stop him. He gathered all the sources he could gather. He didn't have a computer at home. He went to the library. He made photocopies at the library of his paper copies and brought me a stack in a manila envelope that was just packed full of sources. And he wrote notes on them about the book and what kind of citations I would need. He brought me a list of how to start doing lithic analysis, which I didn't know how to do. And in the process of working with him, he would come and he would sit down and he would look at my lithics and tell me, you're on the money or you're not on the money, and this is why, but I'll show you how to do it. I'm not going to do it for you. He's a great mentor. But he also got me into zooarchaeology, which is what I do now, by realizing that I have a paleontology background, which SD also had. He helped a lot of the paleontologists at ETSU, and he knew a lot about faunal remains. And he told me about some sites that he worked on, such as Rotherwood and Eastman Rock Shelter, and said, they're in the basement. Some of it's untouched. Why don't you go look and see what you think? And now I'm a zooarchaeologist, so I have him to thank for it. And he was just an absolute wonderful man. I'm glad I got to know him. And I'm glad that I will be doing my master's thesis on a site that he also dug.
Thanks again, Zoen, for catching up with Jason and, of course, sharing your thoughts here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Before we go to our main interview section, one more perspective from those who have actually worked alongside David Dean over the years and who remember his many contributions to the field of archaeology and history. We're now joined by Jay Franklin, Ph.D. of EcoPlan Associates, who had this to share with us about his personal recollections of working alongside David Dean.
Well, I thought I would say a few words about how I know SD in my relationship with him. And I got hired at ETSU, East Tennessee State University, in 2004. And when that happened, one of my professors at the University of Tennessee, Charlie Faulkner, said, when you get there, you've got to look SD up. And I knew a little bit about his excavations at Eastman Rock Shelter. So I did. And in pretty short order, once I got my classes squared away, and I started going out with SD, he started sharing what he knew with me. And quite honestly, we became friends in short order. And I'll say this too, I came to depend on him, and maybe more than I should sometimes, but he had a passion for the prehistory of Upper East Tennessee, and that includes the paleontology as well. But it was just a wealth of information in his head, a wealth of experience, and one that I very quickly trusted, sometimes more than myself. Before I go on, we used to do, and they still do, artifact and fossil ID nights at the Natural History Museum in Gray at ETSU. And if SD was there, and most of the time he was, the rest of us were really obsolete unless it was just a large crowd. And I don't mean just the archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists. He could cover it all. And he knew geology from out here. He used to come out to the Rock and Gem show out here. He spent some time on the landscape out here. I was always surprised I could give him a rock or something, and he knew where it was from. So not just an artifact. And I think, my forays into Upper East Tennessee archaeology, I had been working on the Cumberland Plateau, some in France with some friends. I wasn't terribly interested. I mean, I felt like I had enough to do, but just hanging around with SD and seeing some things and knowing his experience, we got into a lot of things. And I said it in the Secrets of Nolichucky film, how much I respect him, and that I wouldn't have done that project without him. And that's true. And that there were several projects in the last few years that I did at ETSU that I wouldn't have attempted without his efforts, but certainly his expertise. I think I said it in the film. I just watched it again the other day. He's quite literally, and SD was never able to finish his undergraduate degree. He's quite literally, and I've been fortunate enough to work in a lot of places with a lot of people, not just in the Southeast. Finest excavator I have ever been in the field with, and it's not close. And people just marveled at his walls, his floors, the way he cleaned things, the way he could find things. He's just almost an artist. And, everything's gone digital now, but if you look at his field maps, whether they're plan view or profile from his Eastman Rock Shelter days or working with us, just unbelievable. And copious notes. He except for the degrees, which, maybe that doesn't even matter. Just a real professional, a real asset, and a joy to be in the field with. But like I said, we became good friends in the process too. And he's just really one of the most genuine, humble, decent human beings I have ever been around. He wasn't looking for credit. He wasn't looking for accolades. Early on, I think some of this stuff embarrassed him. I was instrumental in putting together with Tennessee Council for Professional Archaeology a Lifetime Achievement Award for him. I don't remember if it was 2006 or 2008. I think he was really shocked and kind of a little embarrassed. He was very pleased, of course, but he wasn't looking for that. I think that changed as he got closer to the end. He was very, very grateful for people appreciating his work and his efforts and the contributions that he's made. And I was so thrilled with the folks at ETSU now that did the tribute for him this past summer, and there's a plaque of him in the museum. But I don't know. I'm not going to say too much more because I don't know if I'll get through it. But it just one of my dearest friends in the entire world, and love that guy, and I will miss him fiercely. But I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have been friends with him and worked with him for 15 years. He's a wonderful human being.
Many thanks to all of you guys who have taken time out of your busy schedules to join us here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal and discuss the work of the late but truly great David Dean. It won't be forgotten. And please, of course, always check out all of our work there at 7ages.org, and also, of course, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and on our YouTube page, where we will have new content dropping in the days ahead. And last but not least, we also now have our Patreon page. We'll have that linked in the show notes and, of course, over there at 7ages.org, so that you can keep up with all of the content, every bit of it, that we produce every month here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. And with that, gentlemen, I think it is about time for us to get to the heart of this conversation. We have long remained fascinated with Mississippian art and iconography. And on this episode, we are joined by a couple of very special guests, Bretton Giles and Shawn Lambert, who will join us here in mere moments to share insights into this topic that you likely have never heard. That and much more awaits when we return right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. An incredible conversation awaits about the Mississippian culture, one of the most enigmatic early cultures of North America. And joining us tonight are a couple of guests whose work and, of course, their efforts to bring together new minds on this topic are fundamentally reshaping certain aspects of the way that we look at the past. Bretton T. Giles is a supervisory archaeologist and curation specialist who is part of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at Kansas State University. He's an archaeologist who is primarily focused on understanding Native American societies in the Great Plains and Eastern Woodlands. Dr. Giles has written most extensively about research on the Middle Woodland and, of course, the Mississippian societies. And he joins us tonight to discuss iconographic themes and much more about this. Welcome to the program, Brett.
Hi.
Brett, in fact, brought along a friend. He's not here by himself. We're also joined tonight by Shawn Lambert. He is a southeastern archaeologist whose primary research focuses on the early Mississippian period, also as would be expected. He has a research interest in the pre- and post-removal Native American period, and in particular specializes in remote sensing and analysis of ceramics, something we're going to get into with him tonight. But without further ado, Shawn Lambert, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Indeed, it is really great to have both of you here. Before I turn this over to Jason, the Mississippian culture was renowned for their distinctive symbols, which we will be discussing with the two of you today. And right here at the outset, I wanted to ask if you could give the listener who may only have a cursory knowledge or none at all about the Mississippian culture, can you kind of in a nutshell, I know this is hard to do, but define really what this is and what their symbology meant to them?
Yeah, definitely. Around 8,900 to 81,000, something completely transformed in the ways in which these indigenous peoples across the eastern woodlands, and especially the southeast and Midwest, were living, communicating, exchanging ideas and objects and materials. Before this, people were living in smaller villages, hamlets. They were building mound centers, but it wasn't onto the size or to the extent of Mississippian people. By 81,000, people started to aggregate together in these large river drainages, and they started to build these incredibly monumental earthwork ceremonial mound centers that had a lot of religious and ceremonial undertones. These are places where people were gathering from across the Southeast and the Midwest, coming together, exchanging ideas, exchanging materials, where the tens of thousands of people were living. So in a lot of these mound centers during the Mississippian period, it's kind of like your urban areas of prehistory, right? Especially in Cahokia, when we think about that now Cahokia could be considered a state-level society and not just a chiefdom-level society. So we are reconceptualizing just how complex the Mississippian people were. During this period, this is the first time that we start seeing Mississippian people grow intensive agricultural like maize to become one of their staple parts of their diet. And those are being traded and exchanged. This is when we start seeing elites controlling the surplus of these goods and these materials, and maybe even controlling the meaning of the iconography that we're looking at, as well as something happens, and we kind of call it the Big Bang, or some people kind of call it the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Others call it the Mississippian Interaction Iconographic Sphere. Something happens around 81,000 where this very similar sets of iconographic themes is kind of explode and spread across the Southeast like wildfire, where people were using very similar types of iconographies. Whether those things mean the same thing in these different contexts is the question, and that's really what Brett and I, as archaeologists, really want to really understand, is to look at this iconography, look at the iconography across time and space in these different contexts, and trying to kind of decipher what these ancient images may have meant to these people.
Very well said. Jason, I want to hand it over to you here, but before we do, Brett, maybe you can help us define that term, iconography, that Shawn has used.
Sure. Iconography is a way of analyzing imagery that breaks it down into different components and then examines how those different components are operating in kind of in context in those different images. So often we're looking at how images are constructed using different elements and motifs, and whether those elements and motifs occur together in different thematic groups. And then do certain motifs or elements occur in multiple thematic groups? Are they used in similar ways, different ways? And then how does that correspond to what we see in other contexts? Do we see those different objects maybe from that, or ceremonial regalia, or pieces in other depositional contexts where you can link them together? A mace is a really good example of this, where you see it being held by Mississippian birdmen, but you also see chipstone examples occurring in some burials and being in caches. And then there's even a wooden one from Key Marco, Florida, that gives you a sense of some of the different places where these representations are occurring, as well as in representation. So it's a process of linking different things together in many cases. And sometimes it's trying to figure out what the natural reference are in terms of different animals or different beings and how they co-occur in different representations.
Yeah, and it's that symbology and that iconography. That's the reason we brought you gentlemen on tonight to talk with us about that symbology. So much of it is so very striking with the Mississippian culture. So many of the symbols are recognizable to all of us working in and around archaeology throughout the Southeast. But to kick things off, the new book by the University of Florida Press, New Methods and Theories for Analyzing Mississippian Imagery. Now, you two gentlemen are the editors of this fine new volume. I've had an opportunity to pore over the book, and I got to say it is truly impressive, and it's really helped me in thinking bigger, using more imagination and being able to see into some of this symbology a little more clearly than I've been able to do in the past. On that note, there's also a great article by Gail Keck called New Insights into Mississippian Imagery that is available in American Archaeology, the fall 2021 edition. So both of those are excellent sources for learning more about what we're going to discuss here tonight. So with that in mind, the Mississippians, as you just described, as a culture, they had tons of symbology and that very striking iconography that I think we all recognize. They did not, however, leave us any type of interpretation of that. So most of it's left up to imagination, comparison to other types of cultures, just trying to figure out what it is that they're trying to portray through that symbology. One thing that really caught my attention in the book was the Mississippian Iconographic Workshop. So there we see a gathering of experts in the field of Mississippian research. So let's begin the discussion there. There you're finding those interpretations of Mississippian imagery, but what is that iconographic workshop and how does it work?
The Mississippian Iconographic Workshop is a gathering of similarly minded archaeologists that work in the Southeast and Midwest. That's been going on for, is it 20, 30 years now? Obviously, Shawn and I have not been involved with it for that long. Some of the founding members are, Kent Riley organizes it. Jim Brown, Jim Knight, George Langford are all founding members. Kevin Smith and George I already mentioned George. Kevin Smith, David Dye have been around for a long time and been participants in it. So has Adam King. So there's some really prominent archaeologists that have made significant contributions by being part of the workshop. Shawn and I joined more recently, but it tends to be an annual gathering of archaeologists that come together and work on particular issues and problems with and interpretations of Mississippian imagery. Maybe Shawn can take it from there.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. That was a really great summation of the workshop. I think it's not just archaeologists too. We can have ethnohistorians, historians. Really important. We need to start including indigenous members into this workshop. I think that would make it much more of a holistic kind of discussion to create these richer narratives of the meanings of these the iconography of the past. But it's kind of a think tank where all these people come together. And we break up into groups, and each group is kind of designated to do a very specific task. So maybe one group is designated to try to decipher and kind of tease out different pieces of a motif. For instance, maybe a copper falcon plate, which is these very thin copper plates that usually have some sort of kind of a hybrid human and bird figure. We call it the Birdman. And perhaps that we are taking pieces of the motif apart to understand those meanings and then putting those back together. So then we can kind of understand, kind of like reading it like a text in a sense. And so we pretty much kind of come out of those workshops getting a better understanding of what specific pieces mean. And a lot of wonderful books have come out as a fruition in terms of edited volumes, symposiums, things like that helps other archaeologists and other stakeholders learn about these different types of iconography.
Yeah, speaking of those books, the very first book I ever got on this symbology was Sun Circles in Human Hands, edited by Funderburk and Foreman. I think everybody probably has that one in their collection. But for many years, that was kind of the go-to for the basic symbology for the Mississippian culture. And so with the new book, New Methods and Theories for Analyzing Mississippian Imagery, we see sort of the next step, I would say, an advancement in that long-held tradition that we've all had of looking at those older interpretations. So the book itself it reconceptualizes how to look at the imagery. But let's talk about what's been done in the past concerning the symbols versus what you guys are doing today.
I would probably add that there's been a number of other volumes since then too, like Hero, Hawk, and Open Hand, which was closely associated with the Mississippian Iconographic Workshop. There's been 2 or 3 more edited volumes as well in the intervening time that are specifically associated, maybe 3 to 5, maybe 5. So there's been a lot of work that has been recently done on the subject. And at times, I think that maybe we've not made a mistake in terms of calling it new approaches to method and theory and in terms of the analysis of Mississippian iconography. But I certainly don't want you to think that we're separating ourselves in different ways from past approaches, because all of us basically read those past approaches and incorporate aspects of them into the perspectives that we pursue, depending on what we're working on.
Right, absolutely. Jason mentioned sun circles in human hands. Again, just a landmark, work, and really still a very good reference. But, we have heard this term, and Jason mentioned this, reconceptualize. Shawn, I think you used that in a recent interview, in fact. Why do we need to continually, as time goes on, rethink what we think that we know? What do we stand to learn from re-envisioning aspects of the past, and how do we do that in an accurate sense of what these symbols, this iconography, meant to the ancient cultures who actually produced them?
I think that's kind of the wonders of archaeology. I think that makes archaeology exciting, is that there's always going to be change in our understanding, and there is going to be that reconceptualization through time as we refine techniques. And one of those techniques is iconography. And one of the things I think our book adds to the previous studies is using high levels of social theory in addition to iconographic methodology to kind of fill in some of those gaps, to kind of maybe understand what this iconography meant in these specific contexts. It kind of is allows us to be less biased in our interpretations as well, and I think that's a strong meander away from some of these previous studies. Is that we're trying to, this especially younger generation, and I'm going to include Bretton into this younger generation, but we are using these high levels of social theory to reinterpret some of these things, because in a lot of ways, if you actually look at the ways in which iconography has been interpreted, it's been very static. There's not been much mobility in terms of the ways in which it's been interpreted, and so and it's really, a lot of it's, if you really think about it, it's atheoretical. And so we're kind of putting that in there, in kind of this melting pot to help understand. And I think one of those parts of looking at that theory is then incorporating decolonization efforts, like working with indigenous people at the same time, so that we can kind of get this idea of how iconography can change meaning through time as well, which is really important.
Absolutely. Shawn, you've pointed out a couple of times the emphasis needing to be placed on bringing the indigenous community into part of this study. Brett, I also want to jump in here with you, and you wanted to add something. Go ahead.
I would also say that this is probably part of a broader movement in terms of looking at the regional variability of Mississippian symbols as well, and historicizing them in a way. And I would say that that's been going on for at least 10 to 15 years now, and that our book is part of that, in terms of looking at different symbols and trying to look at their specificity and how they fit into site histories and trajectories in a much more specific way than used to occur in the past, where there was a broad understanding of the Mississippian period and many generalizations made about the symbols associated with this time period. So you see much more specificity in terms of how do these symbols fit in at Cahokia and Spiro and Etowah in a very specific way, and maybe even in some of the sites that we don't know as much about, we'll see more emphasis on that in the future, like Castellian Springs in central Tennessee. I mean, that's one site that I know that there's a lot of work that has gone on at, and people are writing that up. But we don't know as much about that site and how the different symbols from it fit into these kind of regional patterns as much.
Brett, I want to stick with you for just a moment, because Shawn had also touched on the social science side of all of this. Another term involving the social factor here has to do with social memory. And in addition to representing distinctive artistic motifs that were used by the Mississippian culture, their symbolism has also been described as a way of preserving that social memory among a society, which these symbols did for the Mississippians. Can you speak to that point?
Yeah, I think there have been really clear distinctions made in the past between written languages and imagery. And I think that we probably need to move and kind of recognize that there's space to explore the similarities and differences between written languages and imagery, but kind of in a more detailed fashion, so that we can start to examine in a more robust way how different imagery and different material symbols were closely associated with social memory for some of these different groups. And some of this may go into mnemonics. It may go into both intentional and unintentional things being conveyed by different symbols. So it's a complex subject, but I mean, I think it's something that's really important to explore because most of human history, there wasn't a written language in the sense that we really think about it. So we jump from these kind of, at least in archaeology, we've had these ideas about really early mnemonics from like 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. And then we skip from that into written languages. And there hasn't been all that much work exploring this in-between domain of how imagery corresponds to social memory and is mnemonically charged in different ways.
Yeah, one might even say that the imagery or the idea of pictorial representations of thoughts and expressions of ideas, I mean, that's an almost more innate form of language or communication than written languages. Jason, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with that statement. As we move forward in the conversation, we begin to look at some of those symbols in a little bit more definition. So anyone who's looked into the Mississippian cosmos realizes very quickly that it's a multi-layered concept. There's a lot of things going on there, a lot of very powerful imagery. So through the workshop or through your own individual research, how does one begin to break down those symbols and attempt to gain understanding of them? And Shawn, I'm going to bring this question over to you to begin. Let's talk about the process of trying to understand those symbols. And then also, what are some of the more common symbols that have been the focus of your recent studies? Things like spiders, the avian symbols that you mentioned earlier, the hand symbols, the rattlesnakes, things along those natures. So what is the process and what are the most prominent symbols that you see?
I mean, those are great questions. And I think a lot of those are, we still don't truly understand many of those questions. So we don't have direct answers, I think. But in terms of many of the Native American, also a lot of this literature that we understand that these different divisions of the underworld, the middle world, and the above world, this kind of tripartite type of level cosmological universe has really been learned from early ethnohistorical documents, as well as communicating with indigenous people today. That there seems to be some sort of similar ways in which these Mississippian communities were breaking up their cosmological worlds. And within each of these cosmological worlds, iconographers, we call them, they have specific locatives. That there's images, they could be anthropomorphic or human-like figures, or they can be zoomorphic, which is animal-like figures, or they can be very abstract-like figures, and ones that I like to really focus on. And these particular imageries can be our locatives to these particular worlds. So, for instance, the underwater panther, or the watery creatures like fish or snake, like serpents, even marine shell that can be. So the materials that the things are made of also can be locatives of these specific cosmological worlds. And for instance, the above world is usually sun motifs, or flying creatures like the flying serpent, or maybe even the circle and hearth, this kind of connection to the above world. And many of the Native American communities believe that there's something called the axis mundi, which this is this kind of like central pole like kind of a monument kind of a thing that kind of connects all these worlds together, and that allows these very special, specific people to connect on these worlds at different times. And these images that we find in archaeological context help to help the people who are actually using them and making them connect to these worlds. Now, for me, what I like to focus on, and I think to a lot of iconographers' chagrin and archaeologists' chagrin, is looking at abstract imagery. I find abstract imagery the most fun of all of them because it is a challenge. And I like the fact that I cannot find the locatives, I cannot find the meaning of these abstract abstract motifs all the time, and I think there's a reason for that, and we'll discuss that later. But that's kind of what I like to look at. Some of my motifs are these spiral motifs, concentric circles, things that have that many Mississippian cultures were using, but we find them in a very specific context. So for the Caddo people, we find these spiral and concentric circle motifs on very special purpose ceramics for the most part. And what's in those ceramics and what those ceramics are being used for are usually for hallucinogenic purposes. So they were drinking some sort of liquid, some sort of concoction that put them in an altered state of consciousness. And so technically what I kind of believe is that these abstract motifs could be kind of labels on what they were actually drinking and what that actually meant, but also perhaps these spirals were actually what they were seeing during these hallucinogenic events that we see not only in Mississippian cultures, but we see that very similar iconography being used and depicted when other cultures around the world were using hallucinogenic substances.
Shawn, that's a fascinating point. I want to stick with you on that for just a moment because, again, we look at ayahuasca and some of these, entheogenic substances used primarily associated with South America, but again, there were corollaries in North America as well. You also mentioned this idea of an axis mundi, and we look at different world traditions like Yggdrasil, right? This idea of a world tree and various different kind of totemic representations of a sort of pole, that is really pervasive throughout different cultures. It may be a bit early in the conversation for this, but I would like to ask you, since you touch on the fact that one interpretation, and again, let's be clear about this, one that you have offered is that some of these symbols may represent these kinds of altered experiences that people have, and thereby there could be some continuity with other cultures. Do you find other instances where there seems to be certain continuity with what appears in Mississippian iconography and those of cultures from around the world, and maybe even temporally speaking from other different periods in history or prehistory?
There is definitely continuity in terms of people using similar iconography contemporaneously around the world. Now, in terms of that meaning, what I would argue is that they most likely don't mean the same thing, and what's happening is if they're going into these altered state of consciousness and they're seeing these symbols and they're depicting these symbols on rock art or depicting these symbols on Caddo ceramics, the love of my life, is that most likely these symbols, even though they're universal, they are being the meanings of those symbols are being filtered through a very specific lived experience and very specific histories. So I would argue that for the most part, I would imagine that the meaning of those are going to be quite different, even quite different from the same Mississippian cultures. Now, when we say Mississippian culture, we're not saying that the entire Mississippian world is one culture. It is comprised of probably hundreds and hundreds of different distinct communities who had their own ideas, their own histories. But what's so fascinating is they're using this very similar iconography contemporaneously. And that is what's so fascinating, is that we as archaeologists get to look at how these different communities are using them similarly, but also using them in their own way for their own local traditions that is comprised from their own local histories. That is really kind of what our book is celebrating.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible summary, by the way, and thank you for answering that question.
Okay, so we've discussed several of the sites that you've mentioned: Etowah, Spiro, Cahokia, Moundville, different areas of the country that represent those different symbols, and each one kind of has similar yet its own personality, if you will, its own take on some of these symbols and different iconographies. So as far as focusing in on individual locations, for instance, we know that Spiro is very unique among the Mississippian cultures due to its high level of artistic crafts that were found there, many different forms. Cahokia obviously being sort of a center point for this type of culture, and then the outlying other Moundville, Etowah, places like that. So as we begin to focus in on some of the individual things, is there any symbology or particular symbols that sort of relate to a personality, if you will, of each one of these areas in each one of these locations? Do they have their own take on a generalized symbol?
I mean, this goes back to how styles have been really associated with different places. And one of the things that is kind of interesting is that the production of these regional styles may or may not correspond to where they're deposited. And you mentioned Spiro, but the Craig Mound at Spiro is really one of the places where we see a place where a number of styles from different regional traditions were probably deposited. And two of the most important that we can think of are the Braden style and the Craig style. Now, the Craig style was probably produced in the Caddoan area, as Shawn will attest and can probably speak to in a more robust sense than I can. But the Braden style tends to be associated with the central Mississippi River Valley, so further north and east of Spiro. And it has been associated with Cahokia, but it has probably deeper historical roots in that area that extend further back in time, as we see kind of some of that imagery starting in the central and even upper Mississippi River Valley during the late woodland period on rock art in certain caves. It probably, or it could also extend further east into certainly western Tennessee and central Tennessee, where we get certain symbols associated with Castellian Springs that may be local to that area as well. So we're still trying to figure out what the boundaries are for the Braden style. And at some points, it's kind of this massive artistic style. So that one is a style that may even get broken up into smaller regional styles eventually. And I think Shawn, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he would probably agree with me that there are some different regional differences in terms of the Braden style that probably can be parsed out maybe in the future. There's also other styles that were deposited in the Craig Mound at Spiro as well, and some coming from probably the lower Mississippi River Valley and maybe the central other areas of the central Mississippi River Valley too. So you have these different places that are associated with different styles, and each one of those styles often has different types of representations associated with it. There's more death-like imagery associated with the Hemp Hill style at Moundville, whereas you get different representations of the Birdman more traditionally in the Craig, Braden, and Hightower style. The Hightower style is associated with Etowah.
I understand. You have a general cosmology, if you will, and then, you have to break it down into regional variants and things like that, very much like we see with many other artifacts. But your chapter in the book, you talk about some very specific types of artifacts that seem to relate, something that I find very fascinating. So I just want to read for, just one small portion here from chapter 7 that kicks off the chapter. Carlos Severi has pointed out that many groups who do not have written scripts use mnemonic devices, including ritual objects, as mnemonic props. So in this chapter, you discuss the Pecan Point head pots. So let's get into that, because it's something that we can kind of focus on as a symbol and hopefully learn a little bit more about how that was being used as a mnemonic prop. So what do we know about the head pots?
It's a good example because it really historicizes in a different way. Pecan Point head pots are a very late Mississippian style that kind of correspond to the very late Mississippian period and then continue to be produced after European contact in the central Mississippi River Valley. So we're dealing with something that's much later than many of the things that we see, certainly at Cahokia and at Etowah. It probably corresponds to very late Moundville. So it's really important to kind of temporalize these different objects because different things were produced during different times during the Mississippian period. Pecan Point head pots are basically a representation of a human head and sometimes a neck as a Mississippian bottle. So they were ceramic vessels that depict the face of these different, of different individuals. And they typically have pierced ears, small kind of shrunken noses, either slit or open eyes, kind of slightly parted mouth. And there is some variation in terms of hairstyles. Typically, they were made of shell-tempered pottery. They have typically, most of them have red and white slips placed on them or paint on them. So it's a very evocative style that represents the human head, basically. And there's been some question about whether they represent ancestral figures or important figures of the communities, or whether they're trophy heads that represent basically depictions of the heads that were taken during battles or during violent conflicts.
Yeah, so you've mentioned these objects and these artifacts possibly have been used as like mnemonic devices, and I'm sitting here thinking about the conversation. And do you think they were used as almost like props or as like storytelling devices in conjunction with possibly like oral history, or some type of instructive devices, maybe?
It's possible that they could have been used in that way, and I think some of the motifs that I look at specifically kind of relate to cosmological imagery. So, in that sense, it would kind of go along with that. And some of the ways in which we can kind of break down some of that imagery is that some of them have much more detailed inscriptions on the faces of these different individuals, and they seem to correspond relatively closely to some of the historically documented tattoos that we have for like the Omaha and the Osage. And we have some idea of what those tattoos meant in these communities because of early historic accounts and historic ethnographies for these different groups. So we have some idea about some of how those tattoos relate to the cosmology of these different groups. In addition, we have some kind of linkages with how different representations occur. Like there's around the eyes of some of the individuals, you see avian-like motifs that seem to correspond to other Mississippian imagery, as well as some of the examples that I specifically analyzed. There's like these stacked layers along the bottom of the face that seem to have serpentine imagery that you see on other types of representations in the central Mississippi River Valley. So basically, what I was pointing out is that you have this avian imagery around the eyes, and then the serpentine layers below that. And those serpentine layers seem to correspond to what different groups for the Omaha and Osage consider the different layers of the cosmos or universe. So you get the same numerical numbers reoccurring for that. So in a sense, kind of a recapitulation of what the universe is composed as.
So in essence, we're seeing a number of things, and it's fascinating that you bring up body art or tattooing. We've actually explored that in the past on the podcast. And again, very few, examples of that for fairly obvious reasons. And so it's all the more interesting when we do have examples that seem to correlate with the other kind of art that we find elsewhere. But again, there's the numerological aspect, there is the cosmological aspect as depicted in the symbols itself, and then there's the aspect of, if I interpret this correctly, and Brett, maybe you can kind of expound on this, Shawn, you too, the way that is correlated with parts of the body, so that the actual physical self becomes, in a way, a representation of their cosmological belief system. Do I understand that correctly, Brett?
That is correct. And that's actually very common to see the body used as a representation or a mirror for the larger cosmos. We talk about that as being a microcosm of the macrocosm. And you see that cross-culturally very often. I think that it's also important to remember that many of these societies had really repetitive kind of practices to reinforce these different notions. And you get ceremonialized or repetitive practices kind of re-emphasizing kind of different types of knowledge. So in ways that may have made it memorable or easy to, or embedded in different traditions in different ways.
I agree that looking at not just the motifs themselves, but in combination with the form of the vessel, what the vessel is made out of, is very important, and these different contexts that we find them in. Just because they could be even made by the same potter, we have to understand their distribution as well. Like, where were they being made, where they were being distributed after that, and then how are these different local communities are using them? Because that's when we're going to find their true meaning, I believe.
Yeah, Shawn, and I agree with what you're saying there. And I want to pick it up with you on that point. I want to look over to chapter 9 for a moment. This is the chapter written by you called Imagery in Motion, Object Itineraries of Spiro Engraved Vessels. Again, Spiro is kind of, I would say most people think of Cahokia when they think of the Mississippian, but I've long had an obsession with Spiro and the massive amounts of art that were produced there. It's so striking, the items that were found at Spiro. One thing that's often brought up is the word Caddo, or that style, and I don't think that everyone always understands exactly what that means. So referring to your book, again, quote, Spiro engraved fine ware pottery first made its appearance in the Caddo world, a large region of socially diverse groups that resided in eastern Oklahoma, southwest Arkansas, east Texas, and northwest Louisiana from approximately 1000 to 1200. So let's build on that a little bit more. We've talked about the head pots and the interpretations of those, but when we turn our attention to the Caddo style and in that region, what do we learn from your chapter of the book?
Well, around 80, and we can actually push that date back a little bit further back in time, maybe around even 8850, because there is some instances where we have some early ceramics from that period. So around 8900 to about 1150, 1200, the Caddo people start creating some of the first ever types of vessel forms that we see in the Southeast, including these incredibly well-made bottles and these other carinated bowl-like vessels. And the craftsmanship of these objects is unlike anything we've found in the Southeast. I mean, they are made incredibly thin, 2 to 4 millimeters thickness, which is absolutely, someone who makes pottery as a hobby it's just astonishing that you can get something that thin and build something so complex as some of these bottles were. And this is the first time that we see in the Caddo world in the early Caddo period that potters are making engraved wares. And we also call engraved wares fine wares, where they are meticulous artists, where they are literally designing and almost like mathematically designing how each of these engraved lines are going to be in place on this vessel. And sometimes you can have over thousands of engraved lines that are evenly spaced across the entire body of the bottle. And so that really, this huge transformation from what was happening before, kind of clunkier vessels, much thicker, finding them everywhere. And then we start seeing these creations of this kind of new pottery enterprise, if you will. The problem is that until my dissertation research, we really was thinking that people from across that area that you just talked about, Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, that we kind of had this thought that that all these potters were across the entire Caddo world, and they're making these pots at the same time. So there are many different potting communities. But when I was looking at this early fine wares, what I was noticing is that there's very little, if hardly any variation in terms of the motifs and the design style and the placement of the engraved lines and the overall motifs themselves. Is almost as though there was incredibly strict rules and guidelines on how to make an early Caddo fineware vessel. And so to think that there were hundreds of Caddo communities making this pottery across, 400 to 600 kilometers apart didn't make any sense whatsoever. So my dissertation and my current research is still looking at, is wanted to understand where this pottery was actually being made. And so what I did is I did something called instrumental neutron activation analysis, which is getting pieces of these ceramics and taking them to a lab, and the elemental composition is being studied, and then you can compare the elemental composition of the pottery and match it where it's being made on the landscape. So actually, to a good degree of certainty, find out exactly where this pottery is being made. Now, it really wasn't to my surprise. I think it was to the surprise to a lot of other archaeologists, is that this pottery was not being made everywhere. It was being made in one little area around the Great Bend of the Red River. Probably only a few potting communities were responsible of making this pottery for almost 250 years. And from there, we see this pottery being moved across the Caddo world and beyond, including Cahokia, even possibly way further than that, and being used in totally different ways. Now, in the Caddo world, what's really interesting is that even the Caddo communities, they're using them in very different ways. The Caddo world is divided between the northern, which is kind of like the Arkansas River area, and the southern Caddo, which is kind of the Red River and to the south in East Texas. These two northern and southern Caddo communities were using them very differently. Now, the southern Caddo the community where the local potters were, they were using this amazing fine wares in every single context you can think of. They were using them in cemeteries. They were using them for mortuary ceremony. They were using them for feasting. They were using them in special purpose housing. We find them in domestic contexts. We find them in domestic cemeteries. We find them in trash pits where they're being thrown and broken on purpose after they're being used. You find them being used in every single context. Now, once you go to the northern Caddo region, around 300 kilometers to the north in the Arkansas River area, you see something completely different. They are only using this pottery in a very specific context, and they are only using it for mortuary ceremony. They're only using them for burials. You will not find one piece of this pottery in domestic context or any other context. They've only been restricted to mortuary context, which is fascinating. So what we see here is that once you understand where this imagery is being created, these motifs and the vessels themselves is really important, because locally in the southern Caddo region, they had a very different connotation. These were local fine wares that were being used in mortuary, and they were being used for ceremonial purposes, but they're also kind of in some ways, your everyday wares as well, probably being used in ceremonial domestic context, if you will. Now, because they were being sent 200 kilometers or 300 kilometers to the north, the people who were receiving those, they had a very different connotation. No longer are these local wares, but these are actually foreign exotic wares that are coming from a long distance. And so we think that different meaning was being attached, as well as these different Caddo communities who have very different histories. And thus, that's probably why these are being restricted to mortuary context. And I think that's why I wanted to look at these ideas, kind of looking at the motifs in motion. Like, let's understand where the imagery is actually being dispersed, because sometimes the meaning of these motifs are not as important. And I know a lot of iconographers are probably screaming at me right now, are not as important as understanding the different contexts first. And I think that's why the power of archaeology can help us with that. And I know I'm probably going off on a tangent here, but what's really important here is that I'm hoping that my chapter is a call for decolonizing previous iconographic research, where I relied heavily on communicating with Caddo artists, like contemporary Caddo artists who, they have the history, they have that historical and cultural connection to these ancient imagery and to these ancient objects. And communicating with them made me realize that maybe sometimes the meaning isn't the most important thing. one of the really important Caddo artists, Chase Earls, who is a master Caddo potter, makes some of the most beautiful Caddo contemporary Caddo pottery than anyone else. He kind of likened the meaning of iconography to a Caddo dance, and I love this. I love this metaphor that he did. He said, "Now, the Caddo people, they still have their ancient dances. The footsteps that they've used are something that could be thousands of years old. They remember the footsteps. The dances are the same, but the meanings of the dance is changing. So even though it looks the same, the meaning can be transformed dramatically, and especially through history." Now, my argument is that Caddo pottery is being made for almost 300 years. I would argue that because we're finding these in very different contexts, and just because they look the same doesn't mean that they mean the same thing. If they're finding these different contexts and being used for 300 years, we need to celebrate the idea that iconography can change, is more malleable. The meaning is more malleable and more dynamic. And I think that's a really exciting turn for iconography.
Same dance, different story. That's a great analogy.
I had a question about just the material itself. You said it was made in a very specific area near the Red River, in the bend of the Red River. Do you think that's because of material that was available there, natural resources, or maybe it was the know-how was just really with that small group of folks? Or
I will say that the Red River, just because I'm a pottery nerd and I love clays, the Great Bend of the Red River has some of the best clays for making pottery. And you have to understand that, like you said, the clays from which they were made are very important, right? And when you find a good source like that, being able to create some of these most finely made objects in Mississippian history, I can imagine that those locations are probably esoteric. They're probably restricted, and only a few people can know where these locations are, and they probably pick and choose these specific apprentices to kind of carry on that craft.
Yeah, the entire discussion there is absolutely fascinating, and you've hit on some very key points there. One thing that you mentioned between the North and the South and the way that they were being used differently, I was wondering, is there any symbology? So you have this sort of centralized location of artisans who are creating this incredible pottery, but as it's going to the North versus the South, in those two locations, do you see a different group of symbology being used for the mortuary pieces, or is it a standardized symbology both in the North and the South?
That's a good question. I'm actually in looking at that right now, and I'm doing something called looking at a social network analysis of the motifs and being found. And what I have found is that almost 80% of the early Caddo finders that are being shipped up to these mortuary contexts at Spiro, at these ceremonial mound centers like Spiro, Harlan, Reed, and some others, Norman, is that they definitely had it seems so that they definitely have they definitely wanted designs that were single or double spirals. You rarely find the concentric circles being used in mortuary contexts in these Northern Caddo contexts. It's really interesting, and I'm not exactly sure if it has any. But there's 500 whole vessels that I've studied, and 80% of those are double spirals. That has to mean something in terms of that they're kind of choosing. It's almost like you make an Amazon purchase, like they're almost like telling these local potters what they wanted and what they needed for their own very specific, maybe mortuary programs, their mortuary practices. I find that a fascinating point. It needs a lot of future study to understand if that's something that's significant statistically and culturally. But 80% of the vessels being very using one imagery, one motif across multiple mound communities is probably significant, because we don't see that in the Southern Caddo context. They're using all the different types of motifs from the kind of their early Caddo toolkit.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, as we look at the holistic picture of the Mississippian culture and the various areas of influence, as we approach the finish line here, we'll kind of capture some last final thoughts on the idea of the culture as a whole. So, Brett, we're going to throw it over to you here. And
I would like to add something that just what Shawn just kind of alluded to.
Please.
Because he was kind of talking in a kind of a way about ritual prerogatives and kind of the rights to use certain places or certain imagery, and this is or certain traditions, and this is something that we see in those historical groups that we associate with the Mississippian time period. And just to throw it out there, it could even be that different groups had rights to use particular imagery that were granted to them, so that those things were kind of sent to these northern groups because they had the rights to use them in a way that the other imagery they didn't have the right to use, or the different places. So kind of these rights to use different ritual things were really important historically for a lot of these different Native American groups. And it's something to keep in mind as we kind of look at a lot of this different imagery. Different people may have had rights to tell the stories about different imagery and to relate those different narratives, or to even hold those different objects as sacred as part of sacred bundles. I mean, when we talked about tattooing just a little while ago for these kind of central Mississippian peoples that were associated with Mississippian head pots. Historically, tattooing was associated with tattoo bundles. So it was a very controlled and expensive process of getting an artisan to basically tattoo you. So it was only those individuals that were important in these different societies and had resources that could actually get these tattoos. So they were closely associated with privilege too. So there's these different aspects that I think progressively we're trying to unravel, and these associations that we're trying to kind of take apart and parse out for these different types of symbols and their associations for different regions, and how they fit into the social lives and experiences of these past, basically mostly pre-Columbian and early historic Native American peoples.
I do want to add, I'd add again on what Brett said. It made me think about, which is really important. This is something that I'm going to be writing in my own book next year. Is that this ceramic enterprise that I'm talking about, and this kind of specialization and dispersal of these pots, and this kind of rights or how those types of exchanging and trading was going on. We don't really know that, but what we do know is that most likely these were women. And in the Caddo world, this was a matrilineal society. Women had the say-so in those communities. And this is a new way of looking at the power of women in pre-European contact contexts, and really celebrating that, and which is something that we need to pay more attention of.
Jason, you said for years that, being a flint knapper yourself and being someone who has gone and who has spent a lot of time, looking around for artifacts, all indications point to the idea that the flint knappers may have been the gals who were there at the camp, they may have been the very ones crafting some of these incredible pieces of art. Very much to your point there, Shawn.
I agree. We found that in Paleo-Indian context as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, the entire understanding of all of these cultures, from the Paleo cultures right on up into the Mississippian and then early contact cultures, I think we're constantly reevaluating and redefining what we think we know about them, and that's the process as we move forward, and it's a beautiful thing to be a part of. As we begin to close out the interview here, I would like to get some feedback from both of you gentlemen on the overall standing of the Mississippian culture. It's extremely complex, as we learned here in previous episodes. We've discussed, Cahokia, the rise and fall of that area with Dr. Timothy Poctat and various other scholars from the Mississippian world. And we've learned one thing for sure, that it is extremely complicated. There's massive amounts of symbology. But as we begin to move forward and continue to research the art and the symbology, the iconography, Brett, we'll start with you. How would you define the Mississippian culture overall, the levels of the cosmology, and basically how do we understand it in a modern term?
I mean, I think we make progress in different regional contexts and kind of historical contexts. And this is very much a reflection of what was going on at different time periods, too. I mean, there was a great deal of conflict during the late Mississippian period, and we may be seeing that in terms of some of these pecan point head pots being trophy heads. I mean, this is right after or right during a period of extensive droughts where lots of groups are migrating out of certain regions and into other regions, and different groups are coming into conflict with one another. This is very different from some of the things that are going on earlier during the Mississippian period. So I think we're getting more and more specific about what's happening during different time periods and what is occurring at different times with these symbols and what they're associated with.
Very well said, Shawn. Tying this together.
So one of the most complex questions, I think, for especially archaeologists dealing in this time period, and I agree with Brett, is that, we're very regionally focused. Now, most of my focus for the last 15 years has been on the Caddo world. And what the Caddo world is so interesting is that, and makes it the Mississippian people even so much more complex, is that the Caddo are on the western fringes of the Mississippian world. Thus, we are finding things like Spiro, for instance, where for decades thought it was a similar Mississippian-like mound center where political leaders were living. And now we know for a fact that this Spiro was a ceremonial center, and it was an aggregation spot, kind of a pilgrimage area for people from all across the Southeast to come. That's where in the Craig Mound at Spiro, we find tens of thousands of objects in that hollow chamber. And it was this moment in about 1450 when a lot of these mound centers were kind of collapsing in a sense. It was kind of their last ditch effort to kind of come together, perhaps doing a world renewal ceremony, and trying to kind of save what is being lost at that moment. And of course, it didn't work. Soon after, people left these mound centers and kind of aggregated into these smaller little hamlets. But what we do know now is that we've made a lot of progress in understanding the Mississippian people. And we, from the 1950s, the 1960s, where the idea of what a Mississippian idea was this kind of one static culture who all had the same beliefs and ways of life. And now we know that it's so much more dynamic and fluid, that we know now that two communities just living on a neighboring river drainage could be just 10 kilometers away, could have an incredibly different way of life and incredibly different material culture. Most likely may even have their own distinct language. And thus we need to be looking at this more now, not from the top down as previous archaeologists have done, but looking at this kind of a bottom up approach, looking at not just the people in power, but looking at the people who were the commoners, who were just everyday people. And I think that's when we're going to get a better idea. And lastly, I will going to put this into this podcast one more time, is that it's really important. We still have many, many, many tribal communities who are still alive today, and they have such a breadth of knowledge and lived experience and cultural heritage connection to these sites. And that is another piece of the puzzle that we are only starting to tap into, and that's gaining momentum. And I would love to see that more, because I do think we'll learn even more about the Mississippian people when we do that.
Well, we absolutely agree with you on that, Shawn, and thank you for making that point once again. We want to thank you, gentlemen, for joining us tonight. I have truly learned a lot. You have expanded my knowledge for sure. Again, the book is New Methods and Theories for Analyzing Mississippian Imagery, and that is available from the University of Florida Press. Make sure you grab a copy of that. It is very enlightening and one of the better reads I've had in the last year. So again, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. It has truly been a pleasure speaking with you this evening.
Thank you for having us. It's been really enjoyable.
It was so much fun.
Well, another great episode, fascinating content. I really enjoyed having both of those gentlemen on the show, and I certainly learned a lot. 2022 is off to a great start, and I think this is going to be a really good episode to kick off the brand new year.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And again, I want to thank both of you guys as well as all of our guests. I think we had a record number of guests on this edition of the program, and of course, in memoriam of David Dean, his life and his work in Eastern Tennessee, and of course, those contributions and the way that they extend to archaeology, not just in the Southeast, but really more broadly throughout North America. So again, I want to thank James Waldo, Jason Pentrail, Chase Pipes, and last but not least, all of you out there who support our work. It means so much to us. Guys, as is customary here in the Cross Time Pub, would you join me for one more round?
Absolutely.
I was hoping sincerely that you would. Well, gentlemen, that about wraps it up. Indeed, we kick off another year, and we look forward to the adventure as it continues. And of course, to all of you out there, if you'd like to reach us, just look us up on 7ages.org. You can find our email addresses also, Micah, Jason, or James at 7ages.org. We would absolutely love to hear from you. And don't forget about those reviews on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate all of the feedback and the support we get from all of you out there. So on behalf of James Waldo, geologist extraordinaire, Jason Pentrail, and yours truly, I'm Micah Hanks. We will catch you guys next time right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.